The State and Everyday Struggle by John Holloway. This is from the State Debate, edited by Simon Clark. Introduction. The last 15 years or so have seen the rapid development of new forms of working class struggle around the state. The battlefront between the working class and the state has been extended far beyond what are sometimes thought of as the traditional areas of conflict. Conflict over the regulation of wages and working conditions, and conflict with the overtly repressive part of the state apparatus. The growth and especially the retrenchment of the, quote, welfare state, end quote, has brought an enormous growth in struggles over the state's role in housing, health, transport, education, etc. Many of these struggles have been fought outside the confines of the traditional forms of working class organization. Party and trade union organization have often seemed peripheral to the issues involved. There has been a sense of developing new forms of struggle against the state, but often considerable confusion on how to understand the state which these struggles engage. The development of new forms of working class struggle is the counterpart of the development of the state itself. The growth of the, quote, welfare state and, quote, intervention, and the rise in state employment have meant an increasing permeation of daily life by the state. Over a quarter of the working population in Britain are now employed by the state and are in everyday contact with the state as their employer. For many of these, especially those employed in the public service rather than the nationalized industries, the fact that they are employed by the state rather than by an individual capital is of fundamental importance for the nature of their daily activity. But clearly it is not only state employees who are affected. Workers not employed by the state come into much more frequent direct contact with the state apparatus than was previously the case. This is most obviously true of the various activities affecting the reproduction of labor power: education, health, social welfare, housing. All of these bring the worker into constant direct contact with the various parts of the state apparatus. This is also true of the immediate sphere of production. Although the immediate antagonist for workers employed by individual capitals is still the individual capitalist, the relation between capitalist and worker is increasingly influenced by the state through pay policy, the granting of subsidies and loans conditional on, quote, good behavior, planning agreements, safety regulations, etc. For more and more socialists, the state has become a problem of everyday practice. Undoubtedly, it is these developments which account for the great surge of interest in Marxist state theory in the last few years, for socialists brought by their employment or political activity into direct and routine contact with the various agencies of the state, and understanding of the state is a matter of direct practical significance for their everyday lives. And yet it is hard to see what practical support they can have drawn out of the recent debates on state theory. This is not only because of the language in which the debates have been conducted, a factor making even the best theoretical contributions fairly inaccessible. It is also because of the questions which the theorists have addressed. In what way is the state a capitalist state? What are the structural limitations on state action? How does state expenditure relate to the reproduction of capital? In what way is the development of the state determined by the laws of motion of capital? All these questions are very important, but their relation to the political practice of socialists working in and around the state is a very indirect one. The discussion of the role of state expenditure on social services in the reproduction of capital, for example, certainly has political implications of a general nature, but it is hard to see its relevance to the 9-to-5 practice of a social worker. Again, it is hard to see how the knowledge that the state is a capitalist state, or the injunction to, quote, smash the state, end quote, can guide the socialist teacher in her or his daily confrontation with her pupils. Much of the writing on the state has tended to approach the subject from above. trying to supply answers to the questions which bourgeois theory has failed to solve, or insofar as it has explicitly discussed the implications of the analysis of the state for working class action, it has tended to conceptualize working class struggle solely in terms of party strategy. Consequently, although the resurgence of Marxist state theory has undoubtedly received much of its impetus and support from the development of new forms of struggle, generally non-party struggle, around the state, and from the concerns of the large number of socialists in daily engagement with the state, it does not seem likely that the work of the theorist has contributed very much to the development of those forms of struggle. What we need is a theory of the state as the day-in, day-out class practice of the bourgeoisie. If state theory is to have any significance for those in daily engagement with the state, it must be able to throw light on the developing class practices implicit in the state and on the possibilities of countering them. This paper does not aim to solve these problems, but it does aim to develop in still rudimentary form a framework within which we can begin to talk about the everyday practice of the state and the everyday struggles of socialists against the state. The state as a form of social relations. In order to answer this question, i.e., in order to understand the state as a form of everyday bourgeois class practice, we must try the state as a form of social relations. 1. In order to answer this question, i.e., in order to understand the state as a form of everyday bourgeois class practice, we must try to build more explicitly on recent experiences of class struggle against and around the state. This is not to suggest an anti-theoretical position or a complete rejection of the last few years of debate about the nature of the state. On the contrary, the deficits of the recent accounts of particular struggles around the state underline the importance of developing much more explicitly certain concepts employed or implied in the best of the recent work on the state, namely the concepts of fetishization and state form and the distinction between state form and state apparatus. The task is not to reject state theory, but to draw out and develop the political implications of some recent developments. I refer in particular to the recent, quote, state derivation debate which developed in West Germany and has now been taken up in some other countries. The German academics, true to their historical traditions, have been adept in theorizing in highly abstract form the concrete struggles of others. Without always drawing out the political implications of their work, they have created a new framework for our understanding of the state, a framework which, if properly developed, can permit us to move towards an understanding of the state as class practice. The starting point of the German debate was the critique of those theories, in this case Alpha and Habermas, who divorced the study of politics from the analysis of capital accumulation. However, instead of simply reiterating the connection between capital and the state, the contributors to the debate accepted the separation of the economic and the political and tried to establish logically and historically the foundations of their separation in the character of capitalist production relations. They argue that in order to understand the, quote, relative autonomy of the state, end quote, or better the separation or particularization of the state from the economic, it is necessary to derive that, quote, relative autonomy, end quote, particularization, separation, from the basic structure of capitalist production relations. In order to understand the relation between two things, it is necessary to understand their unity. In Capital, Marx developed his critique of bourgeois political economy from the most basic forms of capitalist social relations. In order to understand the relation between the state and capital, it is necessary to extend that procedure to the critique of the categories of bourgeois political science. They too must be derived from the basic structure of social relations under capitalism. The attempt to derive the state from capital, the focus of the German debate, is not an attempt to derive the political from the economic, but the separation of the political and the economic, and therefore to derive both the political and the economic in their constitutive separate existence, since it is just their separation which constitutes them as, quote, political and, quote, economic, from the structure of the social relations of capitalist production, i.e., from the particular historical form of class exploitation. The task is not to develop a, quote, economic or, quote, reductionist theory of the state, but to develop Marx's method in the materialist critique of political economy to construct a materialist critique of the political. The state, in other words, is not a superstructure to be explained by reference to the economic base, like value, money, etc. The state is a historically specific form of social relations. As a category of political science, the state is a form of thought expressing with social validity the features of a discrete form assumed by the social relations of bourgeois society. Quote, the categories of bourgeois economy consist of such like forms, value, money, etc. They are forms of thought expressing with social validity the conditions and relations of a definite historically determined mode of production. Capital, end quote, Capital Volume 1. The German debate is concerned with developing Marx's method in the critique of the value form, the money form, etc., to elaborate a materialist critique of the state form. A materialist critique is not only an analytical process, it is not just a question of piercing the state form and unmasking its content as capitalist state. A materialist critique is also what Rubin calls a dialectical process, a process of deriving, logically and historically, the genesis of that form from the most basic forms of social relations. Indeed, Marx distinguished his method from the method of bourgeois political economists on precisely those grounds. Quote, political economy has indeed analyzed, however incompletely, value and value's magnitude and has discovered what lies beneath these forms. But political economy has never once asked the question why labor is represented by the value of its product and labor time by the magnitude of that value. End quote. Accordingly, the task which the German theorists set themselves was not only to discover, quote, what lies beneath, end quote, the state form, the fact that the state form is a capitalist state, but to derive from that form the existence of the state as a particular instance separate from the economic, from capitalist commodity relations. The debate produced various answers, but the most fruitful approach would seem to be that of Hirsch, who derives the particularization of the state from the fact that under capitalism, the exploitation of the working class by the ruling class is mediated through the sale and purchase of labor power as a commodity. It follows from the nature of this form of exploitation that the social coercion essential for class domination cannot be directly associated with the immediate process of exploitation, but must be located in an instance separated from individual capitals, the state. The existence of the state as a separate instance is thus dependent upon the capital relation, and its reproduction dependent upon the reproduction of capital. In this perspective, the existence of the political and the economic, for it is only their separation which constitutes their existence as distinct spheres, is but an expression of the particular historical form of exploitation, the mediation of exploitation through commodity exchange. The political and economic are thus separate moments of the capital relation. Where do the German debate and its subsequent developments take us? In what way does it provide a basis for theorizing the state in a manner more adequate to the current phase of class struggle? One of the problems of the debate is that its political implications are never discussed openly by the authors. This, combined with the fact that the authors do not always make a clear distinction between, quote, materialist and, quote, economic, has left their work open to various interpretations and developments, both by the, quote, supporters of this approach and by its critics, and indeed by the authors themselves and their subsequent work, which often obscure the significance of analyzing the relation between the state and capital. One such misunderstanding is to see the debate on the relation between capital and the state as being concerned solely with the, quote, economic role of the state, end quote. Thus, for example, Poulantzas, referring to the debate, can praise, quote, work on the state in Germany, where Marxist discussions of the economic role of the state is probably the most advanced in Europe, end quote. A separate but related misunderstanding is the accusation of, quote, economic determinism, or, quote, economic reductionism. In this view, the attempt to relate the state to capital is an attempt to, quote, reduce the political to the economic, which ignores the, quote, relative autonomy of the state, end quote. Both of these reactions to the German debate come indeed from a perspective which bases its analysis of the political on the, quote, relative autonomy of the state, end quote. While the latter response is a straightforward rejection of the state derivation approach, the former is far more insidious. Instead of confronting the, quote, state derivation approach as an approach incompatible with its own premises, it seeks to casually integrate the approach by curtailing it to a specific area, the, quote, economic role of the state, end quote. What both reactions have in common is a narrow conception of capital and of the relations of production. Capital is seen, if not as a thing, then at best as an economic relation, rather than as a historically specific form of the relations of class domination. But as Marx pointed out, quote, capital is not a thing, but rather a definite social production relation belonging to a definite historical formation of society, which is manifested in a thing and lends this thing a specific social character. In analyzing the state as a moment of the capital relation, therefore, we are analyzing its place in the production relations of capitalism. This is very important because it is the only way in which the development of the state can be analyzed as part of the overall development of the capitalist mode of production. However, to see the state as a moment of the relations of production is very far from, quote, reducing, end quote, the state to the economic. Crucial here is the conceptualization of the, quote, relations of production, end quote. For Marx, the relations of production are not simply relations of the immediate labor process, but are the relations constituted by the valorization process, relations of a total process of social production. The relations of production are not distinct from society. Rather, quote, the relations of production in their totality constitute what are called the social relations, society, and specifically a society at a definite stage of historical development, end quote. Marx. As Lukács has pointed out, Marx's starting point is the, quote, sum total of relations of production, end quote. It is only vulgar materialism from the period of the Second International through to the Stalin period and its consequences that made the relationship between the economy and other aspects of society a unilateral and direct causal one. Many of the theories of the Marxist Renaissance have sought to escape from the vulgar materialist heritage. This has not been simply a movement of ideas. All the new forms of struggle referred to in the introduction called for an analysis which could relate them to the dynamics of capitalism as a total system, yet did not reduce them to mere epiphenomenon incidental to the, quote, real struggle at the, quote, point of production, end quote. It is in this context that we must see the popularity of theories which emphasize the, quote, relative autonomy, end quote, of the state, ideology, and much else from capitalist accumulation. In this kind of view, the notion of relations of production is limited to the narrow sphere of the direct production of commodities, what Marx called the, quote, immediate process of production, end quote. Given this narrow concept of production, a concept derived indeed from the vulgar materialists whom they criticize, the state is then seen as being external to the relations of production, and the analysis is left with no way in which the development of the state can be grasped as part of the historical development of the capitalist mode of production. The analysis of the state as a form of the capital relation, therefore, is not specifically concerned with the, quote, economic role of the state, end quote, nor is it an attempt to, quote, reduce, end quote, the state to the economic. Rather, it is an attempt to analyze the place of the state in the relations between capital and labor, conceived of as a historically specific form of class domination with its own laws of motion. 4. The other crucial question overlooked by both the relative autonomy school and the vulgar materialist is the concept of form. It is characteristic of capitalist relations of production that they do not express themselves in any simple way as relations of domination. Rather, capitalist relations of production are expressed in a whole series of discrete forms which appear not as forms of class domination, but as disconnected things: commodity, money, capital, rent, etc. The process of capitalist production, quote, gives rise to formations in which the vein of internal connections is increasingly lost. The production relations are rendered independent of one another, and the component values become ossified into forms independent of one another, end quote. Capital, Volume 3. Marx's analysis of capitalism and capital can be described as a, quote, science of forms, end quote, an analysis and critique of this, quote, enchanted and perverted world, end quote, of disconnected forms, a critique directed not only at revealing the content, but at tracing the genesis of internal connections between these forms. This theme is made explicit at the beginning of Volume 1 in the section on commodity fetishism, and the course of its elaboration throughout the 3 volumes is traced at the end of Volume 3 in the chapter on the, quote, Trinity formula. This critique, i.e. establishing the genesis and interconnections of the forms, is an essential part of the struggle for socialism. Capital lives by breaking the totality of our existence into apparently timeless, unhistorical fragments. An understanding of the movement for socialism presupposes establishing the unity of those fragments as a historically specific and transitory form of domination. The critique does not dispel the forms, but the critique is an integral part of the struggle to dispel the forms, to transform society. The critique cannot dispel the forms because the categories being criticized, value, money, state, etc., are not mere forms of appearance. Value, money, state, etc. are rather thought forms which express the specific forms taken by relations between people under capitalism. Thus, the money form, which refers neither to a thing nor to a mere concept, but to the way in which the relations between producers have developed in commodity-producing society. Money and the other forms are, quote, forms of social life, end quote. Capital, Volume 1. The forms in which capitalist social relations are reproduced. It follows that the forms cannot be treated as empty logical abstractions. The forms of social life, which they can only be as forms of social life, they can only be understood historically. The scientific analysis of social forms cannot be a purely logical exercise, but is a, quote, matter of reflection post festum on an actual process of history, end quote. Picciotto. I don't know his name. Sol Picciotto. Marxist categories are not logical abstractions, but aids to understanding historical processes. Quote, these abstractions, in themselves divorced from real history, have no value whatsoever. These abstractions can only serve to facilitate the arrangement of historical material. End quote, Marx and Engels. Marx's method is essentially a historical method. Indeed, it is only by approaching historically the forms in which social relations present themselves that they can be revealed as just that, historically specific forms of social relations. It is precisely their inability to analyze value historically, and consequently their inability to conceptualize value as a form, that constitutes one of the principal barriers to the understanding of the classical bourgeois political economists. Quote, it is one of the chief failings of classical economy that it has never succeeded by means of commodities, and in particular of their value, in discovering that form under which value becomes exchange value. Even Adam Smith and Ricardo, the best representatives of the school, treat the form of value as a thing of no importance, as having no connection with the inherent nature of commodities. The reason for this is not solely because their attention is entirely absorbed in the analysis of the magnitude of value. It lies deeper. The value form of the product of labor is not only the most abstract, but is also the most universal form taken by the product in bourgeois production and stamps that production as a particular species of social production, and thereby gives that mode of social production its special historical character. If then we treat this mode of production as one eternally fixed by nature for every state of society, we necessarily overlook that which is the differentia specifica of the value form, and consequently of the commodity form, and its further developments, money form, capital form, etc. End quote. The analysis, Marx, Capital, Volume 1. The analysis of forms must therefore be a historical analysis, and not simply a process of logical derivation. This process has therefore little to do with, quote, capital logic, end quote, a third false interpretation, which does much to obscure its implications. The historical dimension is essential if we are to develop beyond purely formal argument about the nature of the state, and it is also essential if the approach is to retain its critical edge. Being historical, the concept of form is essentially critical. The purpose of Marx's analysis was to undermine the apparent solidity of the bourgeois categories to show that they were not given by nature, but expressed historically specific and transitory forms of social relations. Thus, for example, Marx's analysis of money shows that it is not just a thing, nor a natural phenomenon, but a historically determinate form specific to societies based on commodity production. Similarly, the emphasis on the state as a form of social relations is essentially critical. The state is not just an institution nor a phenomenon pertaining to all societies, but a historically determinate and transitory form of social relations. Consequently, the state cannot be discussed simply as an apparatus or broken into a conglomeration of apparatuses, ideological, mass integrative, repressive, or whatever. Nor can the state simply be analyzed in terms of its functions. What is important is not just the functions performed, but the historical form in which they are performed. Seen in the context of Marx's method of analyzing the genesis of, and hence the internal connections between forms, the emphasis on the analysis of the state as state form is critical in a double sense of the bourgeois conception of the state as a, quote, oh, and there's no quote there, that's just dirt. Seen in the context of Marx's method of analyzing the genesis of, and hence the internal connections between forms, the emphasis on the analysis of the state as state form is critical in a double sense of the bourgeois conception of the state as an autonomous institution. Inherent in the concept of form, firstly, is an emphasis on the interconnection between the different forms, on the unity and separation of the different forms assumed by the relations between capital and labor, and hence on the capitalist nature of the state in capitalist society. And secondly, the concept of form, when associated with the state, draws attention to the historical and transitory character of the capitalist state. Both aspects of this critical dimension are absent from the concept of, quote, relative autonomy, end quote. Drink time. Stretch. Man. God, I'm fat. Okay. All right. Whew. Fetishism and fetishization. One, In the previous section, we underlined the importance of approaching the analysis of the state through the study of its historical development as a form of the capital relation. However, if the concept of form is to be made relevant to the developing forms of struggle referred to in the introduction, it is essential to see history as relating not only to the past, but to the continuing process of social development. The development of the forms of social life is not an ideal process which is ended harmoniously in self-consciousness, but a continuing and ever-renewed process of class struggle. History is nothing but the movement of class struggle, defining and redefining the battlefronts between the classes. Sorry, I really spaced out. The development of the forms of social life is not an ideal process which is ended harmoniously in self-consciousness, but a continuing and ever-renewed process of class struggle. History is nothing but the movement of class struggle, defining and redefining the battlefronts between the classes. As the relation between the classes, the capital relation, develops, so the forms in which the capital relation is expressed develop. As capital itself is challenged by class struggle, the forms of capital are challenged. They must constantly be reestablished and redefined. It would thus be quite erroneous to think of the capitalist forms of social relations as being firmly established at the dawn of capitalism, withering away with the transition to socialism, but existing stably within capitalism itself. Such a concept would locate capitalism in history, but ban history and class struggle from capitalism itself. The determinate forms of capital are not simply historically established, but must constantly be reestablished in their specific determinations through class struggle. In the case of the state, for example, it would be quite wrong to think of the separation of politics and economics as having been formally established when the capitalist state first emerged as such. As Blanca, Jürgens, and Kastendijk point out, quote, "The separation of politics and economics is not an historical act which happens once, but is constantly reproduced," end quote. If, then, we think of the existence of the state as an apparently autonomous institution of one aspect of commodity fetishism, then it is important to grasp fetishism not as an established fact, but as an ever-repeated process of fetishization. 2. That fetishism can never be an established fact is obvious if one remembers that the forms are not just abstract categories, but forms of social life, forms of capital, i.e., forms of class domination. Class domination inevitably means class struggle. Being forms of class domination, the fetishized forms in which capital appears are inevitably unstable. Any system of class relations is inherently unstable, simply because it is founded on exploitation and antagonism, and therefore on resistance and revolt. To think that such a system based on antagonism could ever be stable, could ever be reduced entirely to routine habit, could ever reproduce itself, quote, normally, end quote, without conflict or disruption, as the bourgeoisie would have us believe, is nonsense. We can see all around us that the, quote, normal, end quote, conditions of things is one of instability. Factories, families, schools are all riven by conflict, disruption, and impermanence, far from the havens of peace and tranquility which bourgeois ideology suggests. The veneer of equality and harmony scarcely conceals the daily eruptions of state violence and discrimination on the one hand, and on the other sabotage, truancy, absenteeism, vandalism, and the million other acts of rebellion which capital is constantly seeking to control or suppress. The fetishized forms in which capitalist domination appears can never be a totally opaque cover completely concealing class exploitation from those who are subject to it. The apparent neutrality and fragmentation of the forms, the mystifying disconnections, come into constant conflict with the workers' total experience of class oppression. Money, capital, interest, rent, profit, state, all are commonly experienced as aspects of a general system of oppression, even though their precise interconnections may not be understood. As Marx points out, the interconnections are clearer to the, quote, popular mind, end quote, than to bourgeois theorists. Quote, it should not astonish us that vulgar economy feels particularly at home in the estranged outward appearance of economic relations in which these prima facie absurd and perfect contradictions appear, and that these relations seem the more self-evident the more their internal relationships are concealed from it, although they are understandable to the popular mind, end quote. Capital, Volume 3. The fetishized forms of appearance should be seen as less an impregnable seal than as a thin crust on a seething, bubbling soup. It is not only that the, quote, popular mind, end quote, sees through the categories of the bourgeoisie. Popular action constantly rebels against the forms of human life which those categories express. As forms of human life, they are constantly disregarded, evaded, and resisted. Shoplifting, vandalism, sabotage, tenancy, squatting, etc., all or may be more or less conscious acts of resistance to the forms assumed by the production relations under capitalism. Shoplifting, for example, is an attack, conscious or not, on the commodity form of the product. School truancy attacks the autonomization of the state from society. Such acts generally lack political direction and rarely go beyond isolated and unconscious resistance directed at a particular manifestation of the form rather than at the form itself, so there is generally very little difficulty for capital in absorbing such challenges. The last 15 years or so have seen the development of new modes of more conscious challenge to the bourgeois forms, as witness not only all the interest in, quote, alternative, end quote, lifestyles, communes, cooperatives, etc., but also the growth of struggles in which state workers have refused to accept their autonomization from society, in which factory workers have refused to accept that use value production should be governed by the law of value, in which those involved in struggles of all kinds have sought to find ways of expressing the unity of their struggles as class struggles. Again, many of the movements have aimed more at the evasion of the bourgeois forms rather than being directed against the processes by which the bourgeois forms are constituted and reconstituted. Yet the significance of the development of new modes of resistance to the oppression inscribed in the bourgeois forms of social relations should never be underestimated. However, one assesses the significance of these various forms of resistance, what they do show is that the reproduction of the capitalist forms of domination is never simply an automatic process which can be taken for granted. In order to contain the ubiquitous resistance to class oppression, the forms of that oppression must be constantly developed and recreated. 3. It is in the face of this resistance and these attacks that capitalist social relations must be reproduced. Clearly, the reproduction of capital cannot be conceived of in any static sense as the automatic renewal of pre-given forms of social relations. This is so for two reasons. First, as we have seen, there could be nothing automatic about it. There is constant resistance to the reproduction of capitalist domination, and this resistance itself impels the constant reformulation of the relations of domination. Secondly, the relations are never pre-given. Capital is an inherently dynamic form of social relations. Its unquenchable thirst for surplus value drives it constantly to intensify exploitation and constantly to reformulate, especially through crisis, the relations between capital and labor. The maintenance of capital as a form of social relations, therefore, can only mean the maintenance and restructuring of capitalist social relations, the constant reformulation through crisis of the relations between capital and labor. Inevitably, this reformulation is always a struggle to impose or reimpose certain forms of social relations upon society, to contain social activity within or channel social activity into these developing forms. Now, inevitably, the only way in which this struggle can take place is through the forms of the capital relation. It is essential, then, that we conceive of these forms not as static entities, but as, quote, form processes, end quote. Zone Ratel, 1978, as processes which seek to impose ever-changing but always fragmented forms of social relations upon the resistance inevitably aroused by class oppression. The determinate forms of capital are not only the forms of existence of capital, but the form processes through which capital is reproduced. Capital is reproduced through the constant form processing, i.e., processing into certain forms, forming of social activity. But it is essential to remember that the changing patterns of form processing are to be understood not as a random ahistorical process, but as an interconnected historical movement structured by the laws of motion arising from the contradictions of capital. As we have seen, it is the nature of class antagonism that the form processing is never completed, but is an ever-renewed struggle to impose capitalist social relations upon society, a struggle that becomes more acute as the expansion of capital demands the ever greater subordination of social relation to capital's sway. If the political relevance of form analysis is to be made clearer, it seems essential to develop this aspect, i.e., to analyze the reproduction of forms and the form processing of social activity. The rest of this paper takes a few hesitant steps in that direction with particular relation to the state. The state as form process. 1. The capitalist state is constituted by the particularization of the state as form process. 1. The capitalist state is constituted by the particularization of the political and the economic as distinct forms of social relations. This involves not the separation of the political from a pre-existing economic sphere, but the constitution of both the economic and the political through the fragmentation of the capital relation. This fragmentation of the capital relation into discrete economic and political spheres is perhaps the most important aspect of commodity fetishism. Through this fragmentation, the unified expression of class relations typical of pre-capitalist societies is broken up. In the transition from feudalism, the serf, a term denoting total subjection indistinguishably politically and economic to the lord, becomes wage earner and citizen. On both sides of the divide, class, as an inherently antagonistic relation of production, has apparently dissolved into separate but interlocking and mutually confirming categories. The separation of economics and politics implies the separation of economic and political relations, the constitution of the proletarian as property owner, i.e., owner of the commodity labor power, and citizen, as burr or citoyen, to speak with the young Marx. This separation, however, is not an established fact, but an ever-repeated process. The classless status of citizens comes into constant conflict with the class experience of the bearer of that status, as Blanca, Jürgens, and Kostendijk point out. Quote, the emergence of a political subject of law corresponding to this economic category, property owner, the, quote, worker citizen, end quote, is accomplished through class struggle, because surface categories always constitute more formal equality, while the material inequality posited in the production of surplus value continually calls this apparent equality into question, end quote. The process of separation, the processing of social activity into a political sphere separate from the economic, the processing of social relations into particularized political categories is a constant struggle to suppress the expression of class experience, to suppress class organization. This process, i.e. the state, understood as form process, as process of the particularization of the political as a distinct form of the capital relation, is clearly of enormous importance in ensuring the reproduction of capital. An attempt to understand this process and its development is a necessary part of the struggle against capital. 2. Historically, the separation of economic and political relation coincides with the autonomization of the state. This took place on the basis of the primitive accumulation of capital at a time when the direct relations of capital exploitation was not yet wage labor. Thus, the first moment of the capitalist state is to establish and guarantee exchange as the mediation of production and consumption. This involved the creation and maintenance of individuals as economic and legal subjects, the bearers of reified property relations. Picciotto, 19... At the same time, the establishment and guarantee of exchange implied the development of a coercive instance standing outside the exchange relations and relating to the members of society as individual subjects. Historically, the European absolutist states provided the framework both for the spread of commodity production and the concomitant development of the individual citizen. Quote, "The idea of a general citizenship began to penetrate into the political sphere by virtue of the regime's absolutist nature and the unitary character of the state. To this idea, the notion of general citizen rights was soon added. The population accustomed itself to fixed duties laid down by the state, to taxation and military service, to daily contact with civil servants of a centralized state, and in consequence acquired a sense of political cohesion, the rudiments of a common political interest. The idea of a unified political order became now an innermost concern of the population itself. The individuals became conscious of being a people. Previously, there had been no more than a populace divided up by region and class, a mere object of government." End quote. Hinsa. The centralization of power which replaced the, quote, "parcelized sovereignties," end quote, Anderson, of feudalism found expression also in the atomization of the population into, quote, "a multitude of particulars, of private, though sometimes privileged individuals," end quote. Pogge, 1978. This process of individualization is the first and basic moment of the state form, counterpart of and interlocking with and consolidating the development of commodity owners as economic subjects. With the increasing generalization of production based on commodity exchange, the principle of individualization gradually undermined the ordered hierarchy of the old world and with its system of representation based on, quote, "community," and, quote, "rank." In Britain, the redefinition of society as a mass of individuals was closely tied to the extension and reorganization of the system of representation. In any full development of the argument of this paper, it would be essential to trace the development of this basic moment of the state form, the development of the changing modes of individualization, particularly in relation to the emergence of the welfare state. Although this attempt cannot be undertaken here, the importance of a historical approach must be underlined, for it would be a grave error to mistake forms of individualization current in Western democracies with their parliamentary elections and rule of law for the, quote, "most perfect," end quote, forms of individualization, or the, quote, "normal," end quote, as opposed to the, quote, "exceptional," end quote, expression of the capitalist state. The development of the mode of individualization can be understood only in the context of the historical development of capitalism as a whole. Here, however, it is possible only to emphasize the importance of individualization as the basic moment of the state form. The process of individualization is enshrined in all the basic practices of the state, in the law and administration, in the structures of representation and intervention. In each case, the state isolates people by treating them as individuals, not as concrete individuals with individual peculiarities, but in abstract, general, de-individualized individuals. The abstract nature of commodity-producing labor is here reproduced as abstract citizenship. The relation to individuals is therefore a general relation, a relation in which individuals are distinguished neither on the basis of their peculiarities nor on the basis of their class position. This process of individualization finds one of its clearest expressions in the legal form and the concept of legal rights. Quote, a right is always that of an individual subject, hence to extend or claim, quote, rights for people is a bourgeois legal form is immediately to isolate them, end quote. Picciotto, 1977. But the same process is at work in the daily contact between all the state's administrative agencies and the, quote, public, end quote. Schools, social work departments, housing departments, social security offices all act in a measure which isolates the person coming into contact with them, treats that person as an individual, or as Cynthia Cockburn points out, as part of a family. The representative elections are no exception to the form processing inscribed in the state's practices, despite the sharp distinction which some, for example, Foucault and apparently Poulantzas, have drawn between representation and other aspects of the state's practice. In democratic elections, the population is treated as an undifferentiated mass of, quote, voters, quote, constituents, defined according to arithmetical numbers rather than any membership of class or community. Similarly, the voting process itself, the institution of the secret ballot, is the supreme expression of the privacy of political opinion. Through the institution of the ballot box, resistance to class oppression is channeled into an act of individual private choice between two or more oppressors. This is not to deny that the rule of law and representative democracy are generally more favorable to the working class than a regime in which neither of these prevails. The point is rather to recognize the limits, or rather the oppressive implications of these forms, and not to hypostatize them as achievements of civilization which it must at all costs be preserved. It is a mistake, for example, to make an absolute distinction between the exclusion of the working class from the state before the introduction of universal suffrage and its representation within the state after the event. This is a mistake, firstly, because the working class was able to ensure its representation within the state even before the extension of the franchise, as Foster's study of 1974 of the early 19th century working class politics in Oldham shows. And secondly, representation of the working class within the state through the process of electoral democracy is simultaneously a process of fragmentation, of exclusion as working class. What is involved in the extension of the franchise is thus not an absolute change from exclusion to representation, but a normally very significant change in the mode of representation and exclusion of the working class. It is not representative democracy which limits the power of the state, as Poulantzas in 1978 would have it, but the strength of the working class, whatever its institutional expression. Law, administration, and representation, then, are all practices which individualize, which treat the classes of society as a homogeneous mass of people. The individualization is not an established fact, but a process which consistently obscures the basic structures of society. Pennacook put the point neatly when he wrote, "Democracy, they say, is government by the people, but the people as such does not exist. In reality, society is divided into classes," end quote. To see the state as a process of individualization is not to suggest that this individualization takes place solely in the political sphere, that classes are formed at the economic level and then fragmented at the political level, nor indeed is it to suggest that the state simply consolidates an individualization which is basically established at the economic level, as Poulantzas suggests. Rather, it is the fragmentation of class relations into distinct but interlocking economic and political forms which bring with it the atomization of the working class. The struggle to build up class organization must therefore be a struggle against these forms. This is not to say that it may not be important to use legal action or parliamentary elections as part of a campaign, but if so, it is important that it should be within the perspective of a broader movement aiming at the total transformation of social relations and with an awareness of the individualizing, fragmenting implications of these forms. Three. So far, we have suggested that individualization should be seen as the first moment of the state form, corresponding to the state's basic functions of establishing and guaranteeing commodity exchange. With the establishment of the capitalist mode of production on the basis of, quote, free wage labor, the state develops new functions and a new mode of political formation. On the one hand, the generalization of commodity production brings with it the clearest expression of individualist ideology in the 19th century liberalism and radicalism. On the other hand, with the generalization of commodity production, the establishment of capital, quote, the laws of appropriation or of private property, laws that are based on the production and circulation of commodities, become by their own inner and inexorable dialectic changed into their very opposite, end quote. Capital, Volume 1. The appearance of equality of exchange in the sphere of circulation is increasingly undermined by the inequality of production. The guarantee of the relations of exchange by the state, therefore, increasingly involves the state in the overt regulation of the conditions governing the sale and purchase of labor power. The abstentionism of the liberal idea is at once undermined by the growth of state intervention from the very beginning of the heyday of liberalism. The expansion of state activity means that the state enters into more direct relations with an ever greater number of people. Inevitably, this expansion involves not just an expansion in the quantity or density of relations between the state and individuals, but the establishment of new forms of relations between the state and the, quote, public. The development of new forms of representation / intervention / administration, for these are but three very closely interrelated aspects of the same process, becomes a problem both for the administrators and for those being administered. Individualism, as soon as it is established, is apparently undermined by the development of collective political forms. The primary impulse to the growth in state intervention came from the need to ensure the reproduction of labor power as a commodity. Consequently, the patterns of intervention, administration, representation which developed were structured primarily around the sale and purchase of labor power. The growth of state intervention led to the development of more direct relations between the state, on one hand, and workers and capitalists on the other, defined not as classes nor simply as individuals, but as sellers and buyers of the commodity labor power. As owners of different revenue sources, trade unions and employers' organizations, as the individual citizen is the counterpart of the individual commodity owner, so the new political collectives which began to emerge in the 19th century, very different from the old communities which had been undermined by the individualizing effects of the spread of commodity exchange, were mostly so structured that they interlocked with the economic categorization on the basis of revenue sources. Collectivism is therefore not the absolute opposite of individualism as it is so often presented to be. Rather, it complements individualism and arises on the basis of individualization and the abstraction from the relations of production inherent in the production process of individualization. It is true that, quote, class, end quote, emerges as a category of 19th century politics, but this is class understood not as an antagonistic relation of production, but as a mass of individuals owning the same source of revenue or enjoying similar income. Collectivization obscures the structure of social relations, at least as effectively as individualization. Classes are not only atomized, but the atoms are regrouped in such a way as to make the concept of class seem quite irrelevant to collective struggle. Here again, although it cannot be undertaken here, it would be absolutely essential in any development of this paper to trace the changing modes of collectivization, the changing ways in which capitalism groups us politically. In the modern capitalist state, citizens are lumped together into all sorts of groupings. They are classified first and foremost as families, an extremely important point made by Cockburn, but also as voters, taxpayers, tenants, parents, patients, wage earners, smokers, and non-smokers. Class members are categorized on the basis of consanguinity, of geographical residence, on the basis of income, of housing tenure, of parenthood, of health, of revenue form, of personal habits, never on the basis of class. To understand this process by which classes are defined into the different categories of bourgeois politics is a fundamental problem of state theory, for this categorization not only responds to, but defines and redefines the forms of political organization in bourgeois society. The process of categorization can be seen as the formation of so many constituencies, the grouping together of individuals into at least potential, quote, interest groups based on their common parenthood, ill health, predilection for tobacco, housing tenure, etc. The constituency, both in the usual sense of geographically defined grouping together of voters and in the sense of the functional grouping of people in their relations with particular aspects of the state apparatus, the sense often given to the term by political scientists, can be seen as the basic unit within which political relations are constituted. If constituency is seen in these terms, then McConnell, the radical American political scientist, is clearly right to point to the question of constituency as the fundamental question of politics. Except that he refers to the question of determining the size of the constituency rather than the more fundamental question of the processes through which a constituency is defined as such. It is the manner in which such constituencies are defined which is the crucial problem, the manner in which the massive totality of class struggle is fragmented through state administration into distinct problems for the functionally defined branches of state activity, problems for the Department of Health and Social Security, problems for the Department of Education and Science, problems for the Department of the Environment, etc., and their smaller divisions right down to the division of responsibilities among individual officials, and then the manner in which this fragmentation is imposed upon those who have any dealings with the state apparatus, the manner in which, quote, the rules and red tape that swathe the agency within also reach out to mold the client, end quote. And not only the, quote, client, but the classes of capitalist society. This, quote, molding, end quote, is a struggle to channel class action into the fetishized forms of bourgeois politics, a struggle to constitute the state form. The struggle, let it be emphasized again, can only be understood in the historical context of the development of the class struggle, which is the reproduction and accumulation of capital. The change in the forms of collectivization is not a random process. The developing forms of the capital relation constitute a differentiated whole. A distinction can perhaps usefully be drawn between the, quote, external and, quote, internal processes of constitution, i.e. between the constitution of bourgeois political relations through the interaction of the state and with those out with the state apparatus on the one hand, and the constitution of bourgeois relations within the state apparatus on the other. The, quote, internal, end quote, process of forming social relations is not necessarily less problematical for capital than the, quote, external, end quote, process. Both involve the maintenance/recreation of bourgeois social relations in the face of a contradictory experience. The two processes are, moreover, inextricably interlocked. The transmutation of class relations out with the state apparatus depends upon the maintenance of bourgeois relations within the state apparatus. This implies, firstly, bureaucratic control of the actions of the employees of the state apparatus, a problem of increasing complexity and importance as state employment expands and the state comes to play a more crucial role in the reproduction of social relations. It implies also a fragmentation of relations within the state apparatus, which complements the fragmentation existing in and imposed upon class relations at large. If the fragmentation of class relations at large can be seen as being accomplished, or rather transmuted and consolidated through the reaching out of the, quote, rules and the red tape that swathe the agency within to mold the client or class, end quote, then the same is true in reverse. The fetishized categories of commodity production, quote, reach out, end quote, in transmuted form and mold the internal organization of the state apparatus. This internal fragmentation of the state apparatus then, quote, reaches out, end quote, in its turn to mold and reinforce the fetishized relations of bourgeois society. The question of the internal organization of the state is thus far from being a technical question of public administration. When Aristotle posed his famous question in relation to the distribution of functions in the Greek city-state, quote, we have also to consider whether to allocate duties on the basis of the subject to be handled or on that of the class of persons concerned, end quote. Aristotle was raising not just a problem of administration, but a problem of the most important questions of political organization. 4. Whether as individualization or as collectivization, the constitution of the state, the process by which the structure of relations clustered around the exercise of coercion is constituted, as separate from the economic, is a process of fetishization, of the fragmentation of class relations into non-class forms. Fetishization refers here not just to the creation of certain forms of thought, but to the constitution of the bourgeois, quote, forms of social life, end quote. It involves the organization of our lives in such a way that the important questions, class struggle and transition to socialism, can never be posed in an active manner. What is important here is the material organization of our lives rather than simply the dissemination or inculcation of ideas. As Heide Gerstenberger puts it, quote, instead of assuming that people who do not fight have been successfully trapped by the ideology of the bourgeois state, we should try to analyze the everyday constituents of consciousness in a bourgeois society. And by doing this, we will pretty soon be confronted with the overwhelming presence of bureaucratic structures. Not only are most aspects of life administered, but the integrity of people's lives and the connections between their problems are split up in fractional aspects of administration. End quote. Heide Gerstenberger. In this respect, the emphasis by Foucault, 1977, on the, quote, microphysics of power, end quote, and the, quote, politics of the body, end quote, is a helpful antidote to much of the recent writing on the state. In order to contribute to a more adequate theorization of the state, however, such an analysis would need to be extended to the less spectacular forms of popular contact with the state and to be established on a historical materialist basis, i.e. in relation to the development of the forms of capital seen as a totality. Nevertheless, his insistence on the significance of the material practice of the state is an important one, for it makes clear that the struggle against the state cannot simply be a matter of theoretical enlightenment of the working class, nor simply of the capturing control of or smashing the state apparatus, but must involve the development of material forms of counter-practice, of counter-organization. As Pannekoek puts it, quote, organization is the fundamental principle of the struggle of the working class for the working class's emancipation. It follows that, from the point of view of the practical movement, the most important problem is that of the forms of this organization. End quote. Pannekoek. To this point, we must return in the conclusion. The state as a process of fetishization, then, is a process of reaching out and ordering social relations in certain ways. It is easy to overestimate the penetration of this process into society, and also to overemphasize its importance vis-a-vis other forms of work, e.g. the, quote, dull compulsion of economic relations, end quote. Certainly, as a general trend, the expansion of capital implies the increasing permeation by capital of every aspect of our lives, and this is achieved in part through the state, the growth of state intervention implying the need for a more thorough categorization and representation of our interests. But it is clear from present experience in Britain that there is no unequivocal and irreversible trend towards the expansion of the state's role in this respect. Some conclusions. It is clear that this paper is very much a working paper. The purpose has been to take up a certain theoretical current, the state-form debate, and suggest some ways in which it might be developed to make it more relevant to the development of new forms of struggle against the state. Its argument is that the state must be seen not just as a form of existence of capital relation, but as a moment in the reproduction of capital as a relation of class exploitation mediated through individual exchanges of the commodity labor power as a process of forming social activity in such a way as to reproduce classes as atomized individuals and exclude the possibility of class organization against capital. The conclusion at its most basic level is that the struggles to build class organization must be directed against the state of social relations, must involve the development of material forms of counter-organization which reassert the unity of that which the state pulls asunder. But before developing this in slightly more detail, it is necessary to make two other points relating to crisis and to the distinction between state form and state apparatus. 1. Crisis. In many countries, the present crisis has taken the form of a fiscal crisis of the state. The state has come under attack from the bourgeoisie itself, and significant cuts have been made, especially in the, quote, welfare aspects of the state. It is clear that the left must defend working class against gains which have become enshrined in the welfare activities of the state, yet any straightforward defense of the welfare state which overlooks its capitalist form is highly problematic. Firstly, such a strategy is unlikely to mobilize wide support. The great strength of the bourgeoisie's attack in this area lies precisely in the fact that the state is widely experienced as being oppressive, as witnessed the popular appeal of Mrs. Thatcher's attacks on the overmighty state in the recent election campaign. And secondly, such a strategy misses an opportunity of exploiting the destabilizing potential inherent in the retraction of the state. The problem must be seen within the general context of crisis and its impact upon the stability of capitalist relations. The contradictions of the capital relation express themselves in a constant tendency towards the periodic outbreak of crisis. Crisis, if it is to be overcome within the framework of capitalism, involves a restructuring of the capitalist relations of production. The relation between capital and labor must be restructured if it is to be maintained by increasing the rate of exploitation, altering the ratio between constant and variable capital, accelerating turnover, etc. The problem, however, from the standpoint of capital is that although restructuring is essential for the maintenance of the capital relation, restructuring may at the same time imperil the continued existence of that relation. In a period of restructuring, the maintenance/reimposition of bourgeois relations becomes particularly difficult. The, quote, dull compulsion of economic relations, end quote, either becomes so sharp for those still employed that it may provoke reaction, or it becomes so blunt for the long-term unemployed that it may lose all effectiveness. Consider the slightly different but very instructive case of poor Mr. Peel, who decided that it would be more profitable to, quote, restructure, end quote, his capital by moving to West Australia. Mr. Peel, quote, Mr. Peel, who took him with him from England to Swan River, West Australia, means of subsistence and of production to the amount of £50,000, or $50,000. Mr. Peel had the foresight to bring with him, besides 3,000 persons of the working class, men, women, and children. Once arrived at the destination, quote, Mr. Peel was left without a servant to make his bed or fetch him water from the river, end quote. Unhappy Mr. Peel, who provided for everything except the export of English modes of production to Swan River, end quote. Capital, Volume 1. But we need not go so far as West Australia to find the very existence of the capital relation threatened by its restructuring. It is clear that the restructuring nearly always subjects the continued imposition of the relation to a severe strain. This can be seen, for example, in the strikes connected with the, quote, rationalization, end quote, and wage restraint in Britain in the late 60s and early 70s. Crisis is not only a technical question of restructuring inputs into the process of production, it is a crisis of the social relations of capital production. The crisis, as a crisis of production relations, extends not only to the immediate process of production, but also to the state in its various moments. Here, too, the bourgeois form must be restructured if it is to be maintained. Here, too, the restructuring of the bourgeois form subjects its continued existence to particular strains. The crisis of the state form is just as inevitable as the crisis of the capital relation is, in fact, one moment of that crisis. The mobilization of the counter-tendencies to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which takes place through crisis, means a massive restructuring of social relations, involving, as Hirsch points out, the whole, quote, reorganization of a historical complex of general social conditions of production and relations of exploitation, end quote. Hirsch. The fact that increasingly, the mobilization of these counter-tendencies is effected through the state means that inevitably the whole complex of political relations is increasingly directly permeated by the general restructuring of the general relations of production. The crisis and restructuring of the capital relation as a whole is inevitably also a period of crisis and restructuring of the forms of constituting bourgeois political relations. Thus, to take the obvious example, the present attempt by British capital to raise the rate of surplus value does not simply mean the introduction of new technology or the implementation of wage cuts by individual capitals. What is involved is rather a very long and extremely complex struggle conducted at all levels, embracing such elements as the repeated attempts to restructure the relations between trade unions and the state, and relations within the trade unions themselves, such as the Donovan Commission, In Place of Strife, Industrial Relations Act, Social Contract, massive ideological campaigns on productivity, inflation, etc., changes in the state expenditure and taxation, complex interplay of political parties, plans to introduce worker directors, etc., etc. The point that the crisis of capital is inevitably also a crisis of the state form is perhaps worth emphasizing, if only because it differs from the view taken by a number of other authors. The problem is often approached through a discussion of the relation between, quote, economic crisis and, quote, political crisis, end quote. Many authors argue against the widespread but simplistic assumptions that economic crisis leads more or less automatically to a crisis of the political system. Countering this view, however, these authors either evade the problem by emphasizing the relative autonomy of the political, or in the better cases, suggest that whether the crisis is in the economic base gives rise to a, quote, political crisis, end quote, and, quote, ideological crisis, end quote, will depend on the organization and militancy of the class struggle, and organization and militancy which cannot be derived from the capital form. Superficially, of course, this is correct. Such an approach, however, does have several weaknesses. Most fundamentally, it treats the capitalist crisis as an economic crisis rather than as a crisis of the capital relation, which inevitably involves a restructuring of that relation in both its economic and its political forms. It then presents, quote, political crisis, end quote, as a possible catastrophic crisis of the political system rather than as an inevitable process of restructuring the forms of political constitution. Such an approach is dangerous because it tends to focus attention on the fetishized forms of bourgeois party politics, and to present a, quote, top-down, end quote, view of the political system rather than the, quote, bottom-up, end quote, perspective of the working class in struggle. It tends to distract attention away from the less dramatic but very significant restructuring of the political constitution, a process which is inherent in the crisis and restructuring of capital. The restructuring is of great practical importance because it poses new problems for socialist strategy and opens up new opportunities for action. The attempts to recategorize the population in terms of communities, regions, nations, consumers, parents, participants in the enterprise, social partners of one sort or another, these make up the crisis and restructuring of the political form. These are the changes that create willy-nilly new forms of political organization, impose new problems and new opportunities which cannot be waved out of existence by a dismissal of the, quote, reductionist, end quote, identification of, quote, economic, end quote, political, end quote, crisis. It is important to understand the changes taking place as a process of restructuring and potential and destabilization. The problem with the simple stress or defending the old forms of state now being overcome is that it not only misses this opportunity but effectively squashes this opportunity by asserting the neutrality or potential neutrality of the state. 2. State form and state apparatus. The struggle to reformulate the social relations of capitalism takes place not only with the state apparatus, and not only through the action of the state apparatus upon society, but also within the state apparatus itself. The antagonism and conflict which pervades the whole of capitalist society are present equally in the state apparatus. Resistance to the oppression inscribed in the state form is not only external to the state apparatus, also within the state apparatus, both in the activity of state employees and elected representatives, and in the behavior of state, quote, clients, end quote, fighting back against the oppression which seems implicit in their relations with the state. Often, these antagonisms are expressed simply in individual acts of rebellion with little political consequence, but sometimes they take more significant forms: organization by claimants, community workers joining tenants in protest against state housing provision, community health council workers organizing workers to disrupt the activities of the area health authority, etc. Each of these may be seen as attempts to confront the oppressive definitions implicit in the state, to challenge the limits of the state form while remaining within the framework of the state apparatus. To conceptualize these struggles, it seems inevitable that we should make some distinction between state form and state apparatus. We have already seen that the concept of the state form is an essentially critical one. Its purpose is to emphasize that the state cannot be understood as an autonomous institution, but only in the context of its historical interconnections with the developing forms of capital. Nevertheless, this does not mean that the institution does not exist. The form must have some institutional embodiment. It is thus possible to speak of a, quote, double dimension, end quote, of the state as relation of capitalist domination and as apparatus. Now, clearly, the form cannot have a disembodied existence. It is materialized through the institutional development of the state and the activity of the state agents. Similarly, the institutional development of the apparatus can only be the expression of the historical development of social relations. Nevertheless, the distinction between form and apparatus does acquire significance if we view the matter from the point of view of the socialist employee or, quote, client, end quote, of the state. For socialists in this position, there is little doubt that they work within the state apparatus. However, their problem as socialists is to shape their daily activity in such a way that they do not simply act as agents for the reproduction of capitalist social relations. Their problem, in other words, is to maintain their daily contact with the state apparatus, for this is normally a practical necessity, and yet combat the processing of social activity usually implicit in the actions of the state, to work within the state apparatus and yet against the state form. The extent to which this is possible will depend on the general constellation of class forces, but for the socialists working within or entering into routine contact with the state apparatus, who does not want her or his socialism to relate only to evening and weekend activity, thus consigning herself to the fate of Sisyphus, rolling the rock of socialism up the hill at night only to see her alter ego rolling it down again during the day? This is an absolutely unavoidable problem. In thinking about the problem of those engaged in daily contact with the state, then it is necessary to distinguish between the state apparatus as an institutional network of financial and administrative controls and the state as a form of capitalist social relations. The, quote, double dimension, end quote, of the state must be retained and explored. This is certainly not to suggest that the state apparatus is a neutral venue for class struggle. Although the state apparatus must be distinguished from the state form, its general shape and detailed minutiae have been molded by the state imposition of bourgeois forms upon class struggle. The state apparatus can be seen as an institutional fossil of past struggles to reproduce bourgeois forms. Thus, the conformity of behavior within the state apparatus with the bourgeois forms is normally more or less ensured not only by the informal codes of conduct, but by the host of administrative and financial regulations backed by force, which are the institutional outcome of those past struggles. The significance of organizational structures is constantly changing in the course of class struggles, so that it becomes, in particular circumstances, more or less meaningful to struggle within or through the state apparatus against the state form, against the constitution of social relations on a fetishized basis. The success or failure of such a struggle will always depend on the general constellation of class forces and the degree to which such a struggle is integrated into the general process of class struggle. It is impossible, therefore, to define a priori the limits of such a struggle. The point to be retained, however, is that the relation between form and form's institutionalized expression is not the same in the case of the state as it is in the case of an enterprise. The imposition of the state form upon the state apparatus does not take place directly through the operation of the law of value on the market, so that the problem of the limits to which the bourgeois form can be transcended is different in the case of the state apparatus from the case of an individual enterprise. The problem for capital is to maintain the bourgeois forms of social relations increasingly through, and therefore also in, the activity of the state, even if it means breaking up the state apparatus in order to maintain the capitalist and with it the state form of social relations, as in the case of regional devolution or political independence. The problem for socialists is to break through the state form as an integral part of smashing the social relations of capitalism. For most socialists, especially those who are either employed by or come into daily direct contact with the state, this must at least occasionally involve struggle within or through the state apparatus against the state form. There is no way in which this problem can be avoided. There is no way in which one can remain class neutral in one's contact with the state. Either one is playing a part in the fetishization of social relations, or one is struggling against it. In recent years, the oppressive nature of the everyday practice of the state has been more often emphasized by libertarian radicals than by socialists who have perhaps been too aware of the limitations of the radicals' practice. The weakness of the radical experiments in the early 70s, however, lay not so much in the fact that they tried to develop alternative practices before the revolution as in the fact that, firstly, they did not conceive of these practices as part of a long process of class revolution, and secondly, their practices, being directed to the liberation of the individual rather than the class, were reintegrated into the normal forms of bourgeois intercourse with relative ease. The extent to which socialists can act through particular state institutions in a manner directed against the state form, i.e. in a manner which will lead to the strengthening of class organization, is always a question of tactics, the changing forms of class struggle, and hence the changing forms of process of constituting bourgeois political relations are constantly creating new possibilities of action and closing others as the significance of particular institutions for class struggle changes. While it is clear that any decisive rupture of the state form as a form of social relations presupposes the smashing of the state as an apparatus, it does not follow that we must await the smashing of the apparatus before directing our activity against the fetishizing processes implicit in the state form. 3. Against the state form. This paper has argued that much of the recent state theory has failed to respond to the developing forms of working class struggle, analyzes the analyses of the state which focus on fractional conflicts within the state apparatus, on the determinants and limitations of state action, or on the functions performed by the state may or may not be important, but they are of little direct assistance to the socialist, party member or not, who comes into daily contact with the state apparatus. It may be important for a social worker or social security claimant to understand the role of state social expenditure in the reproduction of capital, but it is never clear how any such analysis can guide the social worker or claimant in her or his daily activity. To dismiss the daily activity of the social worker or social security claimant as being irrelevant for the overthrow of capitalism or irretrievably capitalist in nature before the great day of the revolutionary event is not only unhelpful for the vast majority of socialists who are not and cannot be full-time professional revolutionaries, but ultimately reactionary in effect, for there is no way in which contact with the state apparatus or any other aspect of social activity can stand outside the class struggle. We have suggested that in order to begin to lay the basis for an understanding of the daily practice of the state, it is necessary to focus not on the functions, but on the form of the state, and to develop some of the insights to be found in recent German work, but to develop them in a much more explicitly political manner. The state does not simply perform certain functions, but performs them in a certain way which categorizes or confirms the categorization of classes into individuals, families, superficial groupings of one sort or another, all of which abstract from class relations. And yet it is only by the constitution of explicitly class relations that the transition to socialism can be put firmly on the agenda. The task, therefore, is not to work through bourgeois forms to gain positions of, quote, power and, quote, influence, the hopeless destructive illusion of Euro-communism, but to work against these forms, to develop through practice material forms of counter-organization, forms of organization which express and consolidate the underlying unity of resistance to class oppression, forms of organization which stand in opposition to the fetishized and fetishizing forms of bourgeois politics and economics. What is revolution but the process of weakening and ultimately breaking the bourgeois form of intercourse, a process of the daily puncturing of bourgeois forms as a necessary prelude to that final decay which will lay a radically new basis for struggle? To imagine that you can weaken the old forms of intercourse by working through them is nonsense. It is not possible at the end of this paper to do that for which the paper itself provides no basis, to set forth a concrete program for transcending the state form in daily practice. Such an analysis can only be based on a full historical analysis of the changing bourgeois forms, an analysis which lies beyond the scope of this paper. A theory of anti-bourgeois forms can no more be drawn out of an ahistorical hat than can a developed theory of bourgeois forms. The most basic point, however, which is valid for all bourgeois societies, is that the only way to defeat class exploitation is through class organization. Thus, for Pannekoek, the key point about councils as a proletarian form of organization was that, in contrast to the bourgeois forms of representative democracy, the councils were specifically class-based, quote, founded not on persons but on labor, end quote. How this is to be achieved, how we can best develop forms of organization, quote, founded not on persons but on labor, end quote. How in any given situation the categories of person, community, region, parent, tenant, taxpayer, etc. are to be undermined by class organization cannot be answered in a general paper like this. There is no timeless answer. We must be aware of the hardened concepts of our revolutionary tradition. Quote, socialism is not a fixed, unchanging doctrine. As the world develops, people's insight increases, and as new relations come into being, there arise new methods for achieving our goal, end quote. Anton Pannekoek, 1919.